Okay. Well, I had to actually go back and look to see what part we left off on and how long ago it was since we last looked at this. And although technically the last video I put up on the T was not, I didn't like make it a part because it was just testing the 3-speed, which I kind of did as a separate deal. But anyway, so the last thing we did for this was test the 3-speed, and that happened back on January 12th. So it's been a minute since we looked at this. Actually, shit, almost 6 weeks or 6 days short of 8 weeks. And we left, this is going to be part 8. So, now that I got the block back on the stand, we can kind of look at the block deck a little more. Like I said before, he took 5 thou off, which, in terms of general machining, doesn't sound like, I mean, in terms of machining, 5 thou is a fair bit. But in terms of engine machining, 5 thou is a lot. That's a lot. And on a head, when you go in and you deck a head, for all I'm very, very, very oversimplifying this, so bear with me here. I'm trying to make this for the people that don't know a whole lot about engine work. When you go in and you deck a head, for all intents and purposes, you can take off pretty much all the meat you want to a point. It's not like you can come in and you can take the deck, take the head deck clear up to the bottom of the exhaust and intake ports. I mean, you got meat to play with on a head, because you can go in, do whatever you got to do, cut as much off as you need within reason to get the head back flat, and then you just go in and recut all of your valve seats in and set your valve protrusion where it needs to be, and then you can make all your adjustments up on top with your valve lash with the rocker arms. So you can move those valves up and down, the valve position and the head up and down based on where you cut your deck height to. So you got some adjustment to play with when you do a head. When you do a block, you can't move the crank up and down. I mean, you get into custom pulling engines and racing engines and custom machine blocks, and also that's a whole different ball game. But when you're doing stuff like this, your center of your crank is always going to be right here. So when you take a cut off the top of the block, you literally drop the head down, and those pistons are still going to come up to the same height they always came up to. So you can only shave so much off the top before shit starts running into the head. So that's why you can only deck a block so much. And gas blocks are lower compression. The pistons are usually down a little bit further from the block deck. Not a lot, but a little, because the compression ratio is generally about half what a diesel is. A little bit more than half. But you can't just come in and start hogging material off to make it flat again, because you got to be worried about your height from the base of the block to your deck height. That way you don't run into clearance issues with the rotating assembly, which is why he was only able to take 5 thou off of here, because it was feathering within spec between your two heights. So if you look down through here, you can actually see, because it was high on this end, so this is where the deep cut starts. This is where he took off a total 5 thou. And then you can see, I don't know how well it's going to show up on camera. Yeah, it shows up on camera. If you look down this side, right about here, you can start to see the discolorations in the block from where the head gasket used to lay. And then you get down here, and there's still some imperfections in the block deck, because he couldn't really, he was still cutting some material off because it's still all fresh, but he couldn't quite get all these imperfections out because they were too deep, and he didn't want to take a second cut because he was worried about the overall height of the block. But we're already leaps and bounds ahead, because before, obviously, the block was slanted front to back, which ain't no good. So now the block is level. It might not have all the imperfections out, but the head gasket will take up the rest of that. But just having the sleeves in the correct position, the block level, and relatively smooth, other than obviously a few which back in here isn't really that big of a deal. And the new style head gasket that Brad Mayball made, or custom made for these 310s, should be even more forgiving to this stuff than the original Waukesha head gasket. So yeah, we're not, obviously not perfect, but it's also not a brand new block, so you shouldn't expect it to be perfect. And then this counter bore right here is the one where he just went in and touched it and squared it up. And this is the one where these marks are. This is the one that's going to be low, and we're going to have to shim it. Is that guy right there. He said the other 5 should be right at 4th thou when he did them in his machine. So, or when he cut them and then he dropped the sleeves in and checked them, he said they all should be right at 4th thou. So I got a 2th thou shim and a 4th thou shim. One of those two should get us good on the sleeve height. So that's that. Everything else we got a good look at. Now today I will not be able to drop the sleeves in, because I got a buddy that works up at Deere. He was supposed to grab me some liner soap on Friday. I called him, I texted him, he said okay, and he still forgot it. So hopefully I'll get liner soap on Monday and we can drop the sleeves in. You're gonna get guys that say, well, you can just use Vaseline or you could just use dish soap, and my rebuttal is, if you just drop $5 grand into an engine, why the hell are you gonna cheap out and use something that's not meant to do the job? Because you use dish soap, then you're going to get detergent in your oil, and you're going to get detergent in your coolant, because there's going to be dish soap all over the sleeve. Can't use Vaseline because the coolant O-ring is not rated for petroleum products. That's just why you got to use liner soap, because it's formulated to not hurt the oil O-ring or the coolant O-ring. Just don't be a cheap ass. Buy the right shit. You drop this much money in a motor, don't cheap out at the end. So anyway, and it's only $40 for a big old bottle, and that bottle's big enough you could probably rebuild 20 engines on it. So buy the right shit. I know Deere, Cat, and Cummins all sell the exact same shit in a different bottle, but surprisingly, Deere is the cheapest by far. So, and normally the sleeve kits come with it, but I don't know if I ever showed you the sticker or not. He cut the sticker when he opened the box. But there's a sticker on here that says, "Dear customer, due to a shortage at the manufacturer, this kit has been shipped less the lube 1, which is the liner soap. We apologize for this inconvenience." So normally it comes in the sleeve kit, but this time it didn't, because thanks Uncle Joe and the rest of the left-wing leaders of the world. But anyway, I digress. So what I want to get accomplished today is get all the sleeve kits unboxed, check all my ring gaps, and then we should be able to assemble the piston sleeve rod, or the piston rod assemblies. I can't do anything with the sleeves got to go on the block. Should be able to put all the rings on, put all the pistons on the rods, get all that ready squared away to go, and then hopefully be able to put the bearings in the block, drop the crank in the block, and plastic gauge the crank, make sure we're good there. And what else? Should be able to put the timing gear back on the crank. And I guess we'll see where we are at that point. I can start putting the head together if we make it that far. Basically, just try to start reducing the pile of parts, because once the sleeves go in, it's going to go really quick. Because everything shouldn't have to check anything on the head. It should just have to go back together. Basically, all we got to do is check everything for the rotating assembly to make sure that it's squared away once everything is in the block. So that's basically where we're at. So I'll start pulling some parts out, and we'll start checking ring gaps. Okay, so I got my first set out. These pistons are actually a slightly different design. The piston and rings are a slightly different design than the original pistons. The top's the same, but the side skirts and the ring grooves and everything they got some changes to them. And these are actually different pistons than what I even remember putting in the 1955. But anyway, the top ring is chrome faced, and it's got a cast iron. Actually, I don't think these rings are cast iron. The original rings were cast iron. This does not feel or look like cast iron. But the backer, the ring itself, has got a taper to it. The ring number 2 is just square cut with a don't know if you can see it. One of the corners on the back side is knocked off. It's cut like it's got a 45-degree on it. And then obviously this is your oil ring. Some engines use a 3-piece oil ring. You'll have a top ring, a bottom ring, and then the spring will sit in between them. This one's actually a 1-piece ring with a expansion spring behind it. So these are actually a little easier to deal with, I think. Although they're kind of hard to gap because you got a dang spring in the way. So anyway, all you do is you collapse the ring, stuff it in the sleeve, take your feeler gauge, check and make sure that the gap's right. On these, the top ring and the second ring, they want 14 to 20, and the oil ring, see, and I don't know what they're calling it, a flexible ring. I don't think these are flexible rings. So standard oil ring is 10 to 23. So the oil ring has a little bit more play in it. And then the maximum on all three is 45. So I got a 14 thou feeler gauge, a 20 thou feeler gauge, and don't really need the piston. So yeah, we just take the ring and stuff it down in the piston a little bit. You want to get it down, you know, inch or so. And the whole reason that this is important is somebody a lot smarter than any of us did the math on the cross section of the ring and the piston and the material type and yada yada yada, and figured all this out. And when the engine's cold, your ring gap is open, and as the engine warms up and everything expands, that ring gap closes up. And if the ring gap is too tight, what'll happen is, at the very least, your engine will run hot and it'll lack power because the piston's dragging so hard on the rings, because the rings have nowhere to collapse into, and they're growing out into the sleeve because the ring gap closed up too soon before the ring expanded all the way. At the worst, you seize a piston up, break a rod, all sorts of bad things happen. So that's why ring gap's important. This day and age, the machine, everything's so good that these should be good right out of the box, but better safe than sorry. So let me get a spot to set you up here, and we'll check some rings. Yeah. And it's usually easier to take, or the easiest thing to do is to take the piston and push it down a little bit. That way you know that the ring is flat, because you don't want it cocked or anything, because that's going to screw your gap up. So it's less than 20, but more than 14. So we're good there. As long as you're in between 20 and 14, you're good. That's what we want to see. Yeah, right there is 20 fits, but there's drag on it, so we're good there. And then the oil ring, this guy might be kind of difficult to get in. He's a little stiff. Yeah. He's really stiff. Wow. Yeah. Oh, come on. There we got her. Now this one, that one's in between 14 and 20, so we're good there. We actually want, that one was slightly different. That one was 10 to 23, so it's well within that. So the oil ring will actually let you go a little tighter or a little looser. So that's how you check that. Okay, so this is my last piston. I got all the rings checked. The first 5 are together. And fun fact, the oil ring goes in the sleeve a whole lot easier if you pull the spring out first. But the way these, this only applies to this ring set. Not all rings are put together this way. Like I say, the original rings, at least the way the book explains it to me, is a 3-piece oil ring. These ones are a 2-piece. But there's a wire that holds that spring together, so you pull that apart. And then you put the spring in your oil ring groove and slide it back together. And then you want that joint in the spring 180 off from the split in the ring. So we got the joint here. We're going to put the split in the ring up here. So then you take your ring expander. Damn it. These things are kind of like wrestling a wet noodle. And you slide that together. Careful not to overstretch the ring because you could distort it or even worse, break it. There is no up or down to this oil ring. It's symmetrical, so you don't got to worry about that. As far as the number 2 ring goes, you can get this one of 2 ways, and I'm guessing that they either beveled it on the OD or the ID. These are obviously beveled on the ID. I'm guessing the bevel on the OD is an older design, but without any service bulletins to go with this manual. I couldn't tell you for sure. But anyway, if they're a ring and they're beveled on the ID, they want it up. If they're beveled on the OD, they want the bevel down. So obviously this one's beveled on the ID, so bevel goes up. And then, as far as the top ring, again, this one really only applies to this ring set because all engines are going to be slightly different. That's why you consult your manual. But this one is symmetrical. There's no up or down, so you just put it in however. And then the rings are going to get jostled around before they actually end up going in the block, so it doesn't really matter at this point. But just for example, on a 3-ring engine, you take your ring gaps and you rotate them 120 degrees from each other, so you don't want them in line. So something about like, yeah. Now, we can go ahead and put our rod in. Now, again, normally flat top pistons, this isn't always the case, normally flat top pistons don't have a front or a back, but these pistons, because your swirl chamber or power crater, whatever you want to call it, is offset to one side, and then you got the cutouts for your intake and exhaust valve are offset. So this piston has a front and a back. So front, I marked it on the cardboard so I know, and yada yada yada. So you put it front, we're going to put the front arrow facing this away. And then the rod is marked front because the rod is going to be slightly offset because the end cap goes on from an angle, not straight on. So and this is incredibly important to check on any engine, and there are some engines where even the wrist pin bore in the piston is offset to one side or the other, or on a rod, one of your bores is offset slightly to one side or the other, depending on the engine. So, we take and make sure there's no residue or anything from any sort of protective coating on the wrist pin. And we'll take and put one snap ring in so we got something to butt the pin up against. And they start a little hard, but you should never, I shouldn't say that. Again, I haven't worked on all engines. There might be some engines where the wrist pin is press fit. I just can't think of any offhand. But you should never have to drive the pin in. It should be snug, but you should never have to pound a pin in. If you got to use any sort of tool to drive it in, you got bigger problems, so you want to check something out. Come on, fall in the groove, damn ya. There we go. And there you go. There's a piston assembly done. So the next thing we're going to do is drop the crank in the block and check or plastic gauge of the main bearings. I already put the shells in the blocks. We just got to put them in the main caps. there's that. Okay, once you set the crank in the block, to do this, you just set it in there dry because you got to pull it back out. You don't want anything, you don't want any grease or anything in there. And then you cut off, this is plastic gauge for anybody who's never seen it. And basically it's a precision plastic filament. And you lay it, you cut off little pieces and you lay them on the journals, and then you put your main caps on and you torque them down to spec, and then you loosen them up, take them back off, and when that little plastic wire crushes, you lay this gauge alongside of it, and I can't really, is it going to show up? Focus. It's not going to focus. But each one of those lines has a number next to it. That's the metric side we want, the inch side. And you just lay that next to the, because it'll crush and it'll actually stick to the, it'll either stick to the main bearing or it'll stick to the crank, one of the two. But then you just lay it next to one of these little indicators and it'll tell you how much running clearance you have. And in our case, for running clearance, we want... Can't remember if that falls under crank or main. I think that falls under crankshaft main bearings. Material, running clearance. So 1.5 to 4.5 thou. So basically, the narrower or the wider the cross section is as you crush this, the tighter your running clearance is, because it just keeps getting, you know, fatter and fatter and fatter. So we'll put all the main caps in and torque them down and see how we come out. All right, well, I went through and put all the caps in, torqued them all down the spec, broke them all back loose, and naturally all the plastic gauge came off on the bearings, which makes it a little bit of a pain in the ass. It's easier to measure when it stays on the crank, but that also tells you that crank is nice and smooth. So, and I cut off a little piece of our gauge here, so this is why it's kind of a pain, because this thing doesn't want to bend that way. So that one's at 2 thou. That one's at about 2 thou. That one's at 2. That one's 2. That one's 2. That one's probably closer to 2.5. It's a little bit less than 3, a little bit more than 2. That one's about the same. So all of our mains are in spec. Alright, while the crank's still sitting in the block and we got something to hold it, gonna put the crank gear back on and the wear sleeve for the new rear main. They are both press fit, so they're gotta be heated to get back on. So that's where we're going. Alright, crank's all squared away. Timing gear's back on, repair sleeves on. For anybody that's going to do one of these, the rear main that comes in the kit is a standard rear main that just runs on the crank. If you want the one with the repair sleeve and you order in parts, you have to specify that you want the oversized seal with the repair sleeve, because the seal that just runs on the crank flange won't work with the repair sleeve. And if there's any sort of groove in that crank, you might as well get the one with the repair sleeve. It ain't that much more expensive, and then you know you're not going to have any issues. So before we put the crank in and torque it down, I'm going to put the lifters and the cam back in. That way I can help get my hands down in here and help the cam on through and not booger up the bearings. So that's next. Crank's in, timing gears are lined up. We're good to torque her down. You want to run the cap bolts down snug by hand. That way if there's anything binding up on the dowel pins or anything like that, you can feel it. You don't bend or break anything. And then the main's torqued to 130. So I'll run them up in 2 steps. Go to 70 and then go all the way to 130. Oops, too far. And you start on the center cap. Work your way out. Alright, there's the first pole. And then, just to be safe, you go through and re-click them. There. That's nice and smooth. And got a C and a C that tells you where you line up the cam gear. I am gonna have to pop the cam back just a little bit because there's a oil plug right there that I forgot to put in, but that's easy enough. I just gotta pull the cam back about yay far, so I don't gotta take it all the way out. But I believe this is probably gonna be our stopping point for today, because can't really do a whole lot else without the sleeves anyhow. I mean, I could put the timing cover on. That's actually about it. I can't put the back cover on because I gotta go get a freeze plug to plug this hole. So, but that's progress right there. Oh, and these bolts, I put them in, put 30 weight motor oil on the threads and put some under the head to reduce the drag before you torque them. You don't want to use anti-seize or anything like that, because it reduces your torque spec by too much. But you could do it if you did the math to figure out, because I think anti-seize reduces your torque spec by 65% because it takes that much drag off of the threads. But you don't really want anti-seize inside the engine. So you're better off to use motor oil. So yeah, the lifters are in, cams in, cranks in, all the pistons and rods are put together. So tomorrow I gotta run and get cylinder or liner soap. I need to get another tube of engine assembly lube because that's just about gone and it ain't gonna make it through this project. What else? Oh, that freeze plug. I think that's it. I'm sure there'll be more, but that'll get me started anyhow, so. Anyway, sorry about that. There's people talking. So yeah. I'm gonna tinker with this thing this week in the evenings before I go to work, and hopefully by next Friday, as long as everything goes back together right. The only thing we got, man, it's all wrapped up. I don't want to get it out. That is the re-chromed and ground oil pump shaft, and they screwed it up. So Dad's got to take that back. Hopefully they can have that back by the end of the week. But I should have everything else other than the stuff to put the sleeves in. So if I can, you know, tinker with it for an hour or two every night before work, I should be able to spend way more time on it than that. But by Friday, we ought to have her. Because tomorrow, after I go and do all that running, I don't know how much time I'll have, but tomorrow I might try to put the head back together. At least I'll put the valves in it. Really, that's all I can do is put the valves back. I like to put the valves and the injectors back in it. But I'm not going to put the manifolds back on it until it's sitting in the tractor, because that's going to make life that much easier, not having to work around that stuff. But I can put the valves and the injectors back in the head. Put the sleeves in, check the sleeves protrusion. I mean, it's gonna go. I got the worst of it. Doing the crank and everything is the worst of it. The next time consuming part's gonna be plastic gauging the rods, but that's really the last time consuming part. Everything else is basically bolting stuff back on. So once you get on a roll, it's gonna go pretty quick. So by Friday, I ought to have her just about licked. So, but I'll do some video, and by Friday afternoon, I should have another video up for you, and we'll go from there. So, I guess that's it for this one, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.